Hey everyone. Thanks for tuning in. It's time for the C3 stream. Hello, good evening. Welcome to the C3 stream. It is good to be with you on Tuesday night. It's time for some Tuesday night teaching time. I'm Pastor Andrew, and I have the privilege of walking with you in a series that we've been doing for a little while now. We'll continue walking a narrative look through the Bible. We're kind of going piece by piece, bit by bit, taking off bite-sized chunks as we walk kind of from the beginning through the narrative, looking at the Bible a little bit more as a cohesive whole. The curriculum we're using is called the Divine Drama. It's a great curriculum. It's got pictures to it. We're looking at things like themes, and we're looking at characters, and we're looking at different aspects of what the Bible has within it. And we're spending time in the scriptures itself. So we're not even just talking about it, but we're spending a little bit of time reading it together, which is also beneficial and helpful for us. We want to get you into the Bible, not only understanding it, but familiarizing yourself with it, getting yourself comfortable with it. So there you go. That's what we're going to be doing tonight. Thanks for tuning in and joining us. If you missed any of the previous stuff, guys, as always, go back to YouTube, go to Facebook, go to Vimeo, and you can go back and find the previous episodes where we do track through. So if you need to catch up, no big deal. Tonight, just as a warning up front, so you guys are aware, I have a calendar conflict with my schedule tonight. I have to be at church for an important meeting, and so this is actually a pre-recorded, okay? So this is pre-recorded, and it means that I will not be able to track with your comments in the moment right now. It means that after my meetings are done tonight and after I get home, hopefully I'll be able to check them out and see if there was anything specific. If there are specific questions that you do have, I will try to address them in the coming week when we go back the following Tuesday. But you should be aware, if you're trying to get my attention or flag me down in the comments, this week particularly, this is a pre-recorded, and so I won't be able to answer you live the way that I usually like to, if that makes sense. It's pretty rare when this happens, but every so often I have a conflict that I just can't get out of. So yeah, so heads up, disclaimer there. All right, let's do it. Let's just dive on in, jump on in. We're going to be picking up where we left off. So I will start with a recap, and then we'll dive into the new content from there. But before we dive into the recap, let me do my flashy cool intro. Nice. Okay. And there we go. That's better. Here we go. This is where we left off, guys. We've been walking through the stories and walking through the narrative in such a way that we have landed at one of the most crucial and critical junctures in the entirety of the Bible. This is one of the most significant moments that we get to witness and see, survey, be a part of as Christian people. It's one of those things that we come back to and we study for our Jewish brothers and sisters within the Jewish faith, kind of that faith tradition that gave birth to our own in terms of Christianity and Christ. The Jewish people, this continues to be, the centerpiece, this is it. What we're talking about tonight, like, this is the pinnacle moment of formation within the context of the Jewish faith, because we are going to be looking at tonight is Moses as the lawgiver in the establishment of a covenant relationship between God and God's people, the Hebrews. Remember, when I use that term Hebrew, I'm talking about the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are the three patriarchs that we looked at in previous weeks. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that family, the family of what began with Abraham, is the family that God came to and said, through you, Abraham, and your descendants, I'm going to enact this rescue plan. I'm going to save the world. I'm going to be blessing the entire world through you and through your specific family. Well, Abraham's family ends up being quite large when you get to this point in this story. They've grown to be what would be considered a large nation according to the scriptures themselves. There's a whole bunch of them, but I'm already getting ahead of myself. The reason, or rather, there is a whole bunch of them by this point in time in the narrative story, which is why Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has conflict with them. What had happened is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and his sons, 12 sons, end up moving down into Egypt during a famine, and they take up residence in Egypt. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's a simplified version for you. And at first, life is good for Jacob's sons, particularly Joseph, within the context of Egypt. But as time passes and more generations go by, the benefits and the well-being shifts. All of a sudden, there is this sense of Pharaoh and the Egyptian culture looking at the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and still considering them foreigners, outsiders, resident aliens who have now grown in size and scope, so much so that they threaten the livelihood, the culture, the values, the language, the gods of Egypt. And so Pharaoh puts into action a plan to subjugate and enslave the Hebrew people. The Israelites is another name that we find the scripture refer to them as. Israelites, Hebrews, same thing. So Pharaoh enslaves the Hebrews, he enslaves the Israelites, introducing a caste system. You are a legit citizen of Egypt if you are a pure-blood Egyptian. You are a slave by birth if you are a Hebrew. So all of the Hebrew boys and girls grow up generation upon generation within the context of oppression, slavery, and bondage. God has not forgotten his desire and his blessing and his closeness with this family. And so he raises up one particular individual, Moses, to rescue and enact a rescue plan for the Hebrew people. It also serves as a microcosm, a representative small picture of the bigger picture God is going to do through this family for the rest of the world. In the same way that God rescues this family and the Hebrew people, he is going to, through the Hebrew people, rescue the world. So this is kind of a big deal. All right. It's a big deal. Moses, very interesting character, very complex. You know, when you look at Charlton Heston on the TV, sorry, that's the old school. We finished that with last time. You know, Moses is sometimes often kind of considered like this heroic figure, real upstanding, amazing, influential. He's Moses. He's Moses. Songs, movies, books, etc., etc., etc. I mean, my goodness, he contributed in no small way to the Bible itself. Moses is one kind of a big deal. He's a big fat deal. And yet he has within himself a complex life story. He has misgivings about God. He disobeys God at different moments and times. He does smart stuff, but he does some pretty not smart, kind of dumb stuff as well. He's got murder in his background. There's a part when he first flees the Egyptians, that's because he had murdered someone before God had even introduced himself to Moses personally. But this shady, quirky, complex character, someone who has an identity that is much more mixed in that he was raised by the Egyptians as part of the Egyptian caste while retaining his ethnicity in the Hebrew caste. So he's a real oddball. We covered that in previous weeks. Well, God uses the oddballs. Thank you, Lord. God uses the oddballs to advance his kingdom, and he uses Moses. And there's this conflict between Moses and Pharaoh that we talked about last week. It becomes supernatural. The real underpinning and the real thematic narrative, the reason this story happens is because the problem isn't between Moses on behalf of the Hebrew people versus Pharaoh on behalf of Egypt. The real issue and the real battle here is God versus false gods. God, God's plans, God's will, God's design for humanity versus people's trumped up imaginary understandings of what God is, and constructs of religion, and constructs around humanity, and what matters most in humanity, and systems of oppression, and systems of economic gain, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have this tension not just simply between Moses and Pharaoh, but a much bigger tension between God and God's desires and design for humanity versus brokenness, sin. What happens when people are in charge? The end result is something that we refer to as Passover. Passover is very big, also even in the Christian faith, because it is connected to the person of Jesus. In fact, we talked about this last week, just a touch. Passover is the moment where you have this lamb that was sacrificed, and its blood was spread on the doorposts of the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, and death passed over. God sent death into Egypt, and yet he would pass over if he saw the sacrificial lamb blood on the doorposts. Death would pass over that home. And so the Hebrew people sacrificed a bunch of lambs, put the blood on their doorposts, and death passed over all the Hebrew people, and instead attacked the Egyptians. Okay? Firstborn of all Egyptians dies. Huge loss, violence, and we see in the end there that up until that point, it takes such a drastic, violent act to get through to a violent, corrupt people. It's like the only thing that they actually understand is destruction and pain and violence. And so that's what it takes to actually get through to Pharaoh, who then says, fine, you can go. So Moses leads all of the Israelites, all the Hebrew people, out of Egypt. This famous Passover moment is kind of the catalyst moment for freedom, deliverance, redemption. The Hebrew people are now their own people, and they can worship their own God, and they can decide their own rules, and they can live according to what they think is going to be best for the Hebrew people. So there's also, as much as there's like freedom and deliverance in this, there's also a lot of big question marks of like, well, when Egypt was in charge, you knew what the rules were. You knew what was what. Now, the Hebrew people have to define for themselves, what does it mean to be Hebrew? Up until now, they knew that a Hebrew was born by birth into slavery. They were second-rate citizens, etc., etc. Now, what does it mean to be Hebrew? What does it mean to be part of God's people? What is this large nation of people going to be as they exit Egypt and look for a new home? So, that is where we are picking up from last week. They part the Red Sea. They walk through the Red Sea. Supernatural sort of event. There's... Anyways, let's not get lost in that. Big moment. Big moment. One thing I did want to mention, and I forgot to mention this last week, but I do think it's kind of neat, is if you go back a couple weeks to when we looked at Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. You guys remember Joseph, Technicolor Dreamcoat? Joseph, before he dies, says, when you guys leave, because someday you're going to go back home, when you guys leave Egypt, this is like generations before Moses. This is way before everything we just talked about. Way back when. This guy named Joseph, who is one of Jacob's 12 sons, ends up dying in Egypt. And he actually asks that when the family goes back home, take my bones with you. Take my bones so that I don't live forever in Egypt, so to speak, but take me with you when you go back home. Kind of a neat thing. Let me show you then what happens in Exodus 13 as they're leaving. As Moses is leading the people out of Egypt, as he's leading them from slavery, bondage, and oppression into a new life, a new way of being, a new nation, it says this in Exodus 13. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel to swear to do this. He said, God will certainly come to help you, and when he does, you must take my bones with you from this place. And the Bible is riddled with all of these small little insights that for you and me as the casual readers reading the Bible, perhaps we could look past and we'd be like, what? We don't even remember this, right? But if you take the time to slow down and look, the Bible's filled with all of these little gems in there. This is one of those gems. Moses takes the bones of Joseph with him, fulfilling what Joseph had asked. And you also see Joseph's prophecy, if you will, prediction. God will certainly come to help you. When he does, you must take the bones from this place. This idea that God will come to help you, Joseph didn't have a concept of what his, great grandsons would be in slavery. He didn't know that. But he made this statement even so, that God will come to help you because that's the kind of God you have. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. So cool little tidbit. Wanted to highlight that for you guys. Pretty neat. Pretty awesome. I love when the Bible does that sort of stuff. I just think it's super cool. All right. What are we doing now? So, Moses with Joseph's bones and the rest of the Hebrew people are getting out of Dodge, leaving. They end up wandering around for a little while. They wander around. You can see here on the graphic, there is this circle of chains in yellow, left-hand side, middle, over where we see the Nile, Egypt. That's what Egypt is geographically. That's where Egypt is. Directly to the top portion is the Mediterranean coast. Okay, that's the Mediterranean coast. And then you have Egypt and the Nile. That's what all those tributaries are. And the chains are to signify that bondage and that slavery. You see the circle with arrows coming out of it. One arrow is breaking apart the face of Pharaoh. The other arrow is going into and coming within the chains and then leading the chains out. And that's to signify how God came to the Hebrew people and then leads them out. And where he leads them is into what we refer to as the wilderness, a desert, really nomadic, moving, pitch your tent, and then the next day you break your tent down and go on to the next place kind of thing. They become what they originally were when the family was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Nomadic herders. No small thing to move an entire nation of people. Okay? Now, when I use that nation, don't get caught up on the numbers. Don't ask me for the numbers. And don't bother digging into the Bible for the numbers. The Bible does make suggestions with numbers. Okay? It does. And those numbers, I believe, are most fruitful and helpful for you to get the idea that this is not just like, 50, 60, 70 people, but we're talking a lot of people. Now, is it the same volume as the United States of America when I use that term nation? The USA is a nation. Does it mean that like the entire nation of the USA would just get up and leave? Like that's a good parallel? No, that's not quite the parallel we're going for here, okay? It's just a big group of people. But it's like a big group, It's a sizable group of people. Enough that when you look at them, you're like, that's a lot of people. Enough that there's different, ages and different needs and physical capacities, the ability to walk and not walk. And you got shopkeepers and craftsmen, and you got a city on the move. Okay. You got a nation. So as they're going, they're literally creating little shanty cities out of their, what they have with them. Right. So they've packing up, and they're you have to picture like a city of people basically moving slowly. This is not a fast. When you're moving an entire city complete with grandmas and grandpas and newborns, you ain't moving that fast, okay? This is not an orderly march into the desert like in the military, okay? This is a whole bunch of people clumped together wandering into the desert. When you put it like that, it's no surprise that as they get out into the desert, the people actually start to grumble. They start to have problems. They start to have issues. They start to voice some complaints. And there's a lot of tension for Moses, to the point where the people are even going so far as to say, like, hey, do you remember the good old days in Egypt? At least in Egypt we had food. Sure, we had slavery in Egypt, but at least we had food. Moses deepens greatly his relationship with God as he keeps coming before God in prayer, being like, God, these people are just, oh my gosh. Like, Lord, really? These are the people? This is who you're going to use to save the world? You sure? They seem kind of stubborn, hard-headed. And you can read all this. We're skipping over parts of the Bible, but you get the picture. And God actually intervenes and provides for the people, saying, fine, I gotcha. He ends up sending them what we refer to as manna. Manna literally translates in Hebrew as stuff. Stuff from heaven. That's what it transliterates as. Basically, God says, fine, you're hungry, I'll take care of you. And so large groups of quail, like the bird, like the flying poultry, they basically end up eating poultry and this stuff like manna that, you know, archaeologists and historians and scholars kind of look at manna, and when you ask the question of manna, most people consider it to be like a bread, okay? Some sort of like dewy bread type thing. That basically the Israelites would wake up in this barren kind of wasteland, and there would be something on the ground that they could kind of collect and gather and cook and use to bake. They could like bake it. And that's why we get kind of this sensation of bread. So poultry and bread became kind of the staple diet for the Hebrew people as they're wandering in the wilderness. You're already getting hints, though, of dissatisfaction and hints of brokenness within the Hebrew people. It's not like Egypt was the only problem here, right? That ironically, the Hebrew people themselves have their own problems. They're not perfect. Just because you are part of God's quote-unquote family and that God is going to use this family to change the world and to save everybody doesn't mean that they're all perfect human beings. Far from. The more time you spend in the Bible, and the more time you spend even with this story with Exodus, the more you realize how hard-headed and stubborn this group of people are. What it takes to help break them out of their stubbornness: an encounter with God himself. Eventually, the people end up wandering to Mount Sinai, which is the place where Moses originally met God, sometimes also referred to as Mount Horeb. We saw this last time we got together, and I talked to you about how Mount Sinai is referred to as the Mount of God. And it's because whenever you seem to go to this mountain, big things with God tend to happen. The people set up camp at Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. It's the same place. Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, same thing, just language differences. Same place. So they end up setting camp at Mount Sinai. This is where Moses leads them. Like, we're headed to the mountain, people. So they head to the mountain. And it is at the mountain that some really big stuff happens. At the mountain, not only does Moses meet with God, but the entire Hebrew people end up encountering God. The nation as a whole gets formed in a much more defined, clear way. Let me show you what I mean. Let's look at it together. This is Exodus chapter 19. Okay, so I just skipped a bunch of chapters. The quail and the manna and all that sort of stuff. after they've left Egypt, they end up going, here we go. They set up camp at the base of Mount Sinai, right? So they went into the wilderness of Sinai and set up camp at the base of Mount Sinai. Moses climbs the mountain to appear before God. So he's going to go up and speak with God. God calls to him from the mountain and begins to say some things. Give these instructions to the family of Jacob. Announce it to the descendants of Israel. So, okay, Moses, I got a message, right? I got a message for the people. Here's the message. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me and keep my covenant, that's a big word, you will be my own special treasure from among all the peoples on earth. For all the earth belongs to me, and you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. This is the message you are to give the people of Israel. So basically, God is saying, look, I'm going to establish with you a covenant, a promise, a set of promises between me and you. We're going to establish what we refer to as a covenant. This covenant is going to set you apart, make you different, make you unique in the world. You will be my own special treasure when you look at all the peoples of the earth, when you look at all the other countries and all the other nations and all the other cultures and all the other stuff that's going on. You are going to be distinct. You're going to be distinct because of how our relationship works. You are going to be distinct because of the things that I'm going to ask of you. When people look at you, they're going to say, those people live differently. Those people think differently. Those people act differently. Why is that? Oh, because of their faith, because of their God. Oh, so all the nations in the earth are going to recognize this. You will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. So when you think of a priest is supposed to be the person who kind of, I don't want to use that word choice. A priest is kind of a person who is the intercessor, the mediator between God and another person. Okay? So basically, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, become the mediators of God in the world. Between God and the rest of the world, the priests, the mediators, the intercessors are going to be this group of people. So you got to think like big picture. You've got God, you've got all of humanity, and then you have this special group within humanity that are going to help the rest of humanity and God learn from each other, get to know each other, be that mediator between God and humanity. All right. This is no small thing. I mean, this is big stuff right there. That's some big stuff. Moses, he goes down the mountain. He calls all the elders of the people together and says, hey, this is what God said. Before even knowing exactly what it is that God is going to ask of them, before they even know what it means to be a kingdom of priests, before they even really get the finer details of what all this stuff entails, the people say, okay, yep. Sounds good. We will do everything the Lord has commanded. So Moses brought the people's answer back to the Lord. All right. Then a bunch of stuff happens. God ends up meeting a little bit more intimately and a little bit more personally with those individuals, those leaders, those elders in the community. And in the end, he lays out what it means to be a priest, what it means to be part of God's special family, what it means that they are now going to be in a covenant relationship with God. And it starts with the 10 Commandments. That's pretty good. Did I just like blow your speakers doing that? Sorry. Didn't mean to. My bad. I did it for dramatic emphasis. So God begins with the 10 Commandments, right? And to this very day, the significance of the 10 Commandments cannot be underscored enough. The Ten Commandments provide the foundation for all of the rest commandments that will come. We use that term commandments because they are commands, and yet sometimes they're also referred to as like laws. What God does right now with the elders is basically set up a constitution. Just like the United States has a constitution, laws on how we're going to live, how we're going to act, what are our values, how we're going to navigate the world, democracy, all that good stuff. This is basically what God does with Moses. He sets up a constitution for what it means to be part of God's chosen people, the Hebrew nation. He creates what we would refer to as a theocracy. Theocracy. That is a theocratic or God-oriented government, a faith-based government. That's what God does. God creates a faith-based government beginning with the Ten Commandments and then extrapolating from there. There ends up being 613 laws that the Jewish people have to follow. These laws cover everything from how you're going to treat each other, other nations. It covers diet, sanitation, money, work habits, all sorts of stuff on basically what does it mean to live a healthy life. And you have to contextualize this too. I mean, this was radical back in the day. For God to lay out this stuff down to like diet and sanitation, sanitation was not on the high priorities in the ancient world. Okay? Just saying. Things like taking a bath, which God said, y'all should take some baths. Like, that's probably a good move, you know? Even diet. Don't eat certain things and do eat certain things. You look at what it is, and it actually makes a ton of sense given the context. They don't have what we have, and they didn't know what we know now. They didn't have the science and the research and the understanding. All they had was God saying, hey, this is really smart, so please do it this way. God forms this theocratic government with roughly 613 laws, beginning with the Ten Commandments. These are the Ten Commandments, and they form the basis. They form kind of like everything that comes from here on out, okay? I am the Lord your God, who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. You must not have any other God but me. Numeral uno. Don't have another God. And you must not make for yourself an idol of any kind of image or anything like that in the heavens or the earth or the sea. Don't go carving something and treating it like a god. You must not bow down to them or worship them. Remember the backdrop. They were in Egypt. Guess what they did in Egypt? They worshiped like cats and stuff, okay? They worshiped the sun. God's like, nuh-uh. I, the Lord your God, I'm a jealous God, and I'm the only God. I get all your affection, okay? You don't go chasing after other gods, worshiping them and idols and all that junk. Stay away from it. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. Don't get confused by this. We did touch on this briefly in a different episode, but it is to say that sin is cyclical, has cycles. And sin, because of the power of cycles, can actually be passed on from generation to generation. You already know this, you just haven't thought of it ever like this. I can see in my kids some of the things that I do that are stupid and silly. I already begin to see in my children. The things that I struggle with already have begun to creep up in their natural behaviors. Simply by one, my example, because I live this way, they learn to behave, act, live this way. And secondarily, they're genetically predisposed to those things, okay? So don't get caught up on this. Don't make it more than it is. I lavish unfailing love for the 1,000th generation of those who love me and obey my commands. All right, so he's drawing a juxtaposition here, saying, you know, basically, you know, faith being handed down, faith being passed on from generation to generation is actually a really important and big thing in God's eyes. And so he wants to make sure that you don't pass on idol worship to your kids. He wants to make sure that you focus and don't have any other God but him, the one who rescued you. Moving on. You must not misuse the name of the Lord your God. The Lord will not let you go unpunished if you misuse his name. We talked about names a little bit last week. The significance of what it meant for God to give his personal name was really big. Theologically and in the belief systems in the ancient world, if you knew someone's name and you spoke someone's name, there was a measure of equality and even power that you were able to exert over and against them. To share one's name meant that you could share in their identity. You had a say in relation to who they were and their reputation. So don't casually name drop. Okay? Don't treat specifically God's name casually, and his reputation and who he is and what it means and what it represents when you invoke his name. Don't do that in a silly or don't misuse the gift of his name, his identity. Remember to observe the Sabbath day. Keep it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, sons, daughters, males, females, everybody, even the animals. Nobody and nothing should work. This is totally radical because this is coming to a group of people who were slaves. I don't know if you know this or not. Slaves don't get vacation. They don't get PTO. They don't have a 5-day work week. Slaves work every day, all day. And in fact, we saw that from Pharaoh. God's like, no, I don't want you to live the way Pharaoh tried to make you live. I want you to live focused on me. You can get so busy that you forget who I am, what I'm doing. You can lose yourself in your own priorities. And that can't happen. You need to set aside a day to rest and enjoy my company. You need to set aside a day a week to focus on me and what I am doing and what I have done and spend time with me, be close with me, and reorient your world. Check your perspectives, check your values, check your priorities. Once a week, not just once in a blue moon. Once every week, every 7 days, you need this for your own well-being to recalibrate yourself. This is totally radical. It's radical today, by the way. It's radical today to even do this. Moving on, honor father and mother. There is a shift from this point. We go from number 3, Sabbath, to 4, honor father and mother. There's a change. The first 3 have to do with your relationship to God. The next, everything that follows has to do with your relationship to other people. And your father and mother is the perfect bridge. You learn who God is, and you first conceptualize God based on your parents. This is part of the reason why a lot of people have a really messy understanding of God. Why? Because we have messy parents. And yet, they are our first introduction to the ideas of authority, oversight, someone being greater, bigger, stronger, someone being more larger and more capable than ourselves. Our parents are our first way in which we can even grasp a hold of the idea that there's something beyond ourself. And so that's why they are the perfect bridge as we move from focusing on our relationship with God to our relationship with other people. And he begins by honoring your mom and dad. Honor who they are, what they've done, the sacrifices, the responsibility that comes with parenting, etc., etc. You must not murder. You must not commit adultery. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely against your neighbor. You must not covet your neighbor's house or spouse. No coveting your neighbor's wife or donkey or any of the other stuff, okay? These all have to do with how you treat and interact with others. For what God will extrapolate on all of this is really that the laws by which you live and treat your neighbor. Jesus, much later on in the story, will sum up the entire law and the prophets. He will sum up the entire Old Testament by saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's basically what the Ten Commandments try to do. Sum up everything that's about to follow. Loving God, right? And this is how you love God. And loving your neighbor. This is a synthesis of how you love your neighbor. Everything comes from here on out is getting into the weeds, and not the weeds, but getting into the details. Better way of saying it. Getting into the details. The Ten Commandments is kind of like the highlight reel for what this nation is founded upon, these Hebrew people. Okay? And so there's this big deal. When the people heard the thunder and the loud blast, they saw flashes of lightning, smoke. It's like, what is happening? Don't be afraid. God has come, right? He starts interacting with them. And now you're getting into the other stuff, like proper use of altars and, build for me an altar made of earth, offer your sacrifices. This is how, etc., 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 etc. So what God is doing now is he is taking and creating a nation, a country, a group of people, a community formed around commonly held, commonly shared principles, ideas, cultures, values, laws. That's what he's doing. And he does it in such a way that's actually archaeologically and historically fascinating. Nerd out with me for a moment. So, this is a picture you can see here. And if we look back at what were historical treaty forms in the ancient world, ways in which treaties between one tribe and a different tribe, or one country and another country, were being made, we can see that there were two dominant versions. So, and we know this from looking at scrolls, and we know this from looking at historical records and what archaeologists have discovered how the ancient world worked. And there were two dominant ways in which two parties or two groups would make an agreement, a covenant, a promise. First and foremost, there was the Hittite version. In the Hittite version, you are on equal playing fields. There is what referred to as just parity. A treaty between two equal parties. One nation says to another nation, let's trade. One nation says to another nation, let's make a peace agreement, and here's how. And it's a treaty between equals on equal footing. That was one form. The second form was a suzerainty or a vassal orienting, okay, vassal state. The vassal state agreement followed a certain formula. And the idea here is the big guy, or the stronger country, the stronger group, the stronger, bigger, larger, you get it, thesaurus, there's more words. The bigger group says to the little group, and it follows this specific formula, I'm awesome. Here's what I have done for you. Here's what I want from you. That's it. It's pretty simple, actually. I'm awesome. Here's a list of all the great, wonderful things that I've done for you. And now this is what I'm going to get from you. So the way that this would work practically, I am so-and-so, so-and-so, king of this, and prince of that, and defender of this, and, I am awesome. In my awesomeness, I have defended you from this country, and I helped you in this battle, and I substantiated this city and gave you this good thing and these wonderful gifts. I have done all of the, look at this list of amazing things that I have done for you. I protected you here, I rescued you there, I sent you my support and my generals and my armies, and here's all the good stuff I did for you. As a result, I want you to give me taxes. That's basically how it would work, right? Here's what I want from you. I want, taxes, or I want, trade goods, or I want whatever. And he would make his or her, the larger, bigger group or country would make their demands, if you will. Now, given what we've studied so far tonight, it's fascinating to learn that God actually follows one of these two forms, and it ain't the first one. The Ten Commandments follow a vassal state format. Number one, you see in the bottom picture there, number one is the big king. In this case, God. God, God, God. God's the big guy. The power. The influencer. The deliverer and the rescuer. God is awesome. I am the Lord your God. Okay? Number two, you see a small scroll there, and it's got an arrow pointed towards that big guy, and this is the list of accomplishments or the wonderful things that I have done for you. And that's what God does. He says, look, I delivered you from Pharaoh, from Egypt. I took you out of your slavery, out of your oppression. I delivered you when you were in bondage. I am the Lord your God, and I've delivered you. 1, 2. 3, you see the 2 tablets down there? That's what they're supposed to be, like little tablets. And that's because the 10 Commandments were written on tablets. God is following the format of a vassal state treaty. That's what's happening in the 10 Commandments. Pretty fascinating stuff. He is following to a T. God is following to a T how treaties were formed back in the day. Fascinating. Well, what time is it? How far? Okay, we got a little bit more time, but not much. What's next? Oh, yeah. Oh, we can talk about this. Here you go. This is it even in more detail, actually. There are a couple different places, actually, in the Bible where we get the 10 Commandments in more detail of, like, God giving the 10 Commandments. Let me rephrase that. The story of how we receive the 10 Commandments is told through different voices at different points in the Bible. The one that we're looking at is probably the most well-known, Exodus. So here's another view of that same format. Number 1, I am the Lord your God. Number 2, I delivered you, rescued you from Egypt. As a result, here are the ways and the things that I want you to do. Here's the 10 Commandments, 1, 2, 3. But then God actually follows it up. He does go into a little bit more detail, and he says, look, I want you to pass this on to your future generations. I want you to give this to your children. I want you to write this down. That's why at number 4 you see the preservation, if you will, of the agreement. And this again is following the format of what you would expect from historically a vassal state. I'm awesome. Here's what I did for you. Here are the things I want from you. To ensure that this happens, write this down. And number 5, there's always witnesses. So in the historical context, you would have witnesses sign on, watch you receive this edict from a greater power, and they would serve as the living witnesses to what took place. Well, in God's case, he says all of creation, the heavens, the earth, the mountains, the stars in the sky, and the sun and the moon, serve as a witness. So there are witnesses. It is literally all of creation. All of creation serves as God's witness to the agreement that is being made between God and the Hebrew people. And then lastly, if you fail in this agreement, if you let me down in this agreement, if you don't come through in this agreement, there will be consequences. There will be blessings if you follow through, and there will be curses if you don't. the blessings are, if you do this, if you live this way, if you follow through on what I'm asking of you, you will be blessed. You will be brought to the land flowing with milk and honey. You will be brought to ancient Israel. You will be brought to the land that I promised your ancestors. But if you ignore what I'm asking of you and you don't live as the holy nation that I've asked you to live as, if you ignore all of this and do things your own way, well, then there's going to be problems. I'm going to kick you out of your own place that I'm giving to you. I'm going to kick you out of your home until you get your head on straight. When you don't follow through, there are consequences that will hopefully wake you up and bring you back to the realization that, oh yeah, I'm awesome. Here's what I've done for you, and here's what I want for you. Kicking you out of what I am giving you in the gift of land will hopefully help you realize and come back with a repentant heart. Basically, that's what's going on. And so this is the format of the Ten Commandments, and it follows the archaeological process that we would expect. Really cool. I think it's cool. Come on, you don't think that's cool? I think it's cool. I would like to note it is, yeah, good, okay, it does, I love this curriculum. It does it for us. This type of a covenant is different than the covenant that we see with Abraham. Okay, this is different. It does not follow the same format that we heard God give to Abraham. It's a different kind of promise. When God came to Abraham, way back when we studied Abraham, God just made a bunch of promises in and of himself. He just, this says divine commitment. God made a divine commitment to Abraham and Sarah. Say, Abraham, Sarah, I'm going to give you land, I'm going to give you descendants, and your family is going to bless all the nations of the earth. Period. Abraham didn't have to do anything. There were no hoops. There were no expectations. None of this sort of stuff. There were no laws. It was just simply God saying, Abraham, I have chosen you and your family to be the vehicle for saving the world. Abraham, totally passive. Totally passive. It's like, okay. Now, life gets along better for Abraham when he's just faithful and good to God. But there's no stopping what God has promised. It's one directional. This time, different. Bottom picture. What God is doing and what God is setting up here is much more complex. And that's because he's setting up a country. He's setting up not only a relationship between people and God, but a relationship between people and people. So it's far more complex, far more intricate, far more detailed, and the expectations are far more. Okay? What God is, he's asking stuff from the Hebrew people because he is concerned for how the Hebrew people treat one another. It makes sense. So that's why in the bottom picture, you see way more going on than in the top picture. This is a two-way relationship with dealing with how do you treat God, how do you treat your neighbor. And this promise, the bottom promise, can be broken. The top promise can't. God promised it's going to happen, period. The bottom picture can be broken by people. People can break it. People can break it. By not following and not following through, we intrinsically break the covenant. It is what we describe as interdependent. That God and God's ability to work and thrive and do amazing things with the Hebrew people has to do with the Hebrew people's willingness and ability to embrace, not their ability, but their willingness to embrace what God wants to do through them. If they shut down God at every turn, well, then God can't do what God is trying to do in and through them as kind of a light to the rest of the world, right? So the top picture is about God's promise that will come no matter what. The bottom picture and what we're finding in the establishment of this theocratic government is far more complex, has interdependent realities to it, has to do with God, has to do with your neighbors, and it has consequences in a way that the top one does not. All of this leads to basically what God would hope for as he forms this community, this theocratic nation state. It's a country not defined by geography or geographic location, not defined by a specific constitution the way that we have a constitution, but essentially defined by this religious practice and belief. That's what's defining this country. And as this country leans into this identity, as they embrace these laws, they will live in harmony with God and with one another. This is what God is hoping to do now. Set aside a specific nation as priests through which he will be able to influence and speak to the rest of the world, accomplishing what he promised through Abraham. This is a big deal. Big deal. Big deal. And we see, yeah, perfect. Oh, we should probably end on this too, huh? What time is it? How long? Oh, yeah, I got to finish up. Got to wrap up. So, because, therefore, the idea here is, what the curriculum is trying to do is draw a parallel. God intervened and rescued the Hebrew people based on his promise to Abraham. Based on his promise and his desire and what he promised to Abraham, that's why God intervened for the sake and the well-being of the Hebrew people. That is the bigger promise. That is the more substantial promise. Because God made promises to Abraham, he delivered the Hebrew people from slavery. Therefore, he's asking those Hebrew people now to live differently from the rest of the world, to live in a way that honors him and honors thy neighbor. That same parallel thought process works for you and me as Christians. Jesus came. You see in the top portion there, the right hand square, you see basically life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus is the kneeling figure who is kneeling in service to the disciples, to you and me, to the world. He was crucified. He was buried in the tomb, but rose to new life. Life, death, resurrection of Jesus. And that all occurred because of the Abrahamic promise, because of God's promise to save the world through Abraham. And it's because of Jesus that we now, as Christians, live different. We live different. Not because we have to, not because God is going to smite us if we don't. We live differently, not with like a quote-unquote set of rules or laws of which our salvation is dependent upon, but rather we live differently because we've been given salvation. Make sense? We don't get salvation because we follow the laws. We get salvation, and therefore we are prompted, inspired. Yeah, that's probably the best word for us. We are inspired to live according to the Ten Commandments, according to the teachings of Jesus. Because of what Jesus has done for you and for me, we now embrace and seek to live out our life differently than we would have before. It informs our actions, our thoughts, and how we treat God and one another. So because of what God has done, therefore, we live in harmony with one another, in service to one another, and in love towards one another. That's where we're going to finish for tonight. That's good. That's good stuff. Isn't that good stuff? Yeah, that's good stuff. All right. Okie dokie. Well, thank you for hanging out with me, guys. As always, I think it was really good. It was great. We covered tonight was actually really, really substantial, heady theology tonight. Whoop whoop. I love me some good theology. We just got through a ton of, well, we just covered, so you know, like Exodus. We started in Exodus and just covered a couple books of the Bible in just that snapshot. Like, I told you that there's different examples of where the Bible talks about the Ten Commandments. Deuteronomy is one of these other books that goes deep into the laws. Leviticus goes deep into the laws. Numbers goes deep into the laws. So we just covered a couple books of the Bible tonight, which is cool. We will pick up, and I will take you through on a narrative sense where we go next week, but don't worry about that for now. So good job. That's what I'm telling you. Good job. You just covered basically the first 5 books of the Bible. Well done. We covered the first 5 books basically tonight. That's fun. Well, four of the 5 books. We covered Genesis already. Hey, thanks for hanging out with me. Always good stuff going on at Christ Church. Other ways to get involved. Other ways to get engaged. Go check it out. ChristChurchMikeOne.life. Most notably, of course, though, first and foremost, come and join us for worship. Come to church. Come and be a part of it. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10:30. We're in a sermon series called Giving Thanks or Give Thanks. We're trying to remind ourselves and remember the practice of giving thanks and leaning into that habit of giving thanks more and more in our lives. Particularly in seasons and in a time and in a world that seems too hard to give thanks, we are trying to go out of our way as Christian people to give thanks and demonstrate what it means to give thanks to others. Invite somebody to on-site, pick them up, bring them coffee, whatever, meet them on site, join us on site, online, tag somebody or drop them a link and have them join us for church as well. Hey, you can continue to join me not only on the C3 stream on Tuesday nights at 7:30, but also on Thursday mornings at 7:30 a.m. 7:30 a.m. we do our Thursday morning meditation where we do scripture reading together, prayer together, and then Holy Spirit shout outs. It's only a half an hour and it's a great way to start your morning. It's a good way to kind of begin practicing some spiritual practices and exercise your spiritual muscles. And so just a word of invitation, we'll say, to come and check that out and be a part of that. So join me 7:30 a.m. on Thursday. Otherwise, we will see you Sunday morning at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10:30. Go lift lives. Go elevate Christ. Go be church for those who aren't here yet. Thanks for hanging out with me here tonight. God bless you, and we'll talk to you all soon.